higher yields require high-performance crop nutrition. Through fusion technology, MicroEssentials is designed to increase nutrient uptake throughout the growing cycle. The unique chemical composition of MicroEssentials creates an acid zone around each granule. Lowering the pH promotes the formation of dihydrogen orthophosphate, a more readily available form of phosphate, resulting in increased nutrient uptake. With MicroEssentials SZ, plants more efficiently take up zinc because each nutritionally balanced granule delivers zinc evenly across the field. MicroEssentials also contains small elemental sulfur particles designed for faster oxidation to sulfate and increased uptake. The proof is in the performance. Research shows that plants take up nutrients more efficiently with MicroEssentials compared to traditional fertilizer blends, resulting in higher yields and higher profitability.
You just heard Kara Hart do the markets. Megan Overby is just coming off stage there. Jay Rader should be around here somewhere else here this morning. He'll be around as well. That's our Red River Farm Network crew. Visiting with World Weather Incorporated Senior Ag Meteorologist Drew Lerner. You're going to sit in on a conversation. We're just going to sit and chat here, I think, more than anything else here. If you have questions, raise a hand, and we'll get a microphone over to you. Megan's running around with the microphone. And we'll just talk about whatever's on your mind as far as weather and upcoming. Let's just talk. We've had experienced some D3 and D4 drought across this upper Midwest, both Dakotas, Minnesota, and some very, very harsh conditions going into this fall. Where are we sitting at right now?
Well, we're in a transition at the moment, but I'm not quite sure how permanent it's going to be. We picked up on some rain, late August, and up to now we're still getting some showers and thunderstorms to occur, so that's great. It's definitely what we need. I'm not sure it's going to continue, though. That's the only problem. We've got a lot of things stacked up where we might see more dry bias conditions coming back as we go forward now. But for the next few weeks, this is a time of the year where we get all these crazy storms coming across the region, and we can go from one extreme to the other in a very short period of time. So there's hope that we will see some additional moisture. It's really important that we get it, though. If we don't get that moisture, we're going to come up short, and we've got a lot of short moisture days coming up in 2022, probably.
Sure. We need the moisture before freeze up then, basically.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And it's not just here, it's all the way up into the prairies and all the way down into the Central Plains. The Central Plains are better off than we are, but there's definitely a need for recharge, and the sooner that we get it done, the better it'll be. I don't see bitter cold weather coming for a while, so that's a good thing. We'll be able to go several weeks down the road and maybe get some moisture at the same time. So there's definitely some hope here that we'll do some more recovery.
Yeah. Do you see us having I guess right now, I don't think anybody around here is going to be hurt by a frost if we would get a killing frost. Maybe some guys even probably welcoming it if we would get it, but you see that in the near future?
We've got some cold weather tomorrow morning across the western part of the northern plains and on up into Canada. We'll probably see temperatures in the States running in the middle and upper 30s. We'll get a little soft frost, but there's not going to be any killing freeze or anything like that going on. As far as a killing freeze is concerned, we're probably at least 10 days to 2 weeks away from that. Canada will probably see some harder freezes, perhaps as early as early to midweek next week, but it's just not going to be able to get this far south. But later on down the road, we'll get plenty of cold air to come. So I realized that it would help to end the growing season, and it's kind of nice to get that freeze when we're so far advanced with the crops.
Yeah, especially as early as this crop is. Even yesterday, very, very windy conditions, and so I don't know how long this crop could stand in some of this wind.
That's right, and there's more wind coming. When you're in a dry atmosphere like this and you're transitioning from the summer to the winter, you've got so much dry air that the storms that come in are usually very intense, and because there's no moisture in the air, and so we end up with quite a temperature contrast, which drives the winds even more. So there will be a lot of wind coming up, one day from the south, next day from the north, and we'll just go back and forth like that a lot.
Yeah. All summer long, too, we've been dealing with smoke from the wildfires here. My understanding that smoke was out of the Pacific Northwest in that area?
There's been fires all over. There's even been fires on the other side of the planet. But there was fires up north of Canada, up in their tree country, and there was certainly in the northern Rocky Mountains. All the Pacific coast states, of course, had fires. So it was pretty hard to find a perfectly clear day there for a while in the middle of the summer.
Yeah, and even some of that, I think sometimes I was at a couple of plot days earlier this late summer, early fall, and you could smell the smoke in the air. They were expecting some 90-degree days. Never quite got that warm just because of the smoke, I think.
Yeah, that actually helped to hold the temperatures back a little bit. Goodness, what would we've been seeing for extreme temperatures if we didn't have the smoke there for a while? It was pretty nasty, and so it did help a lot. It maybe helped to pull back some of the degree day accumulation. So, yeah.
Step us through now the next couple of weeks as we work our way into fall and through harvest. What are things going to be looking like? Yeah,
I think these next few weeks we are going to start transitioning. It's that time of the year. We've got cold air that's going to try to come around, but the planet's still pretty darn warm, so the only place that's really persistently cold right now seems to be in parts of Russia, in Siberia. It's a long ways away, so we will cool down like we should, but it'll be slow. We're going to be late with all of our frost freezes, and the precipitation is going to be a little questionable. I mean, we'll still get these systems coming along, and there'll be an opportunity for a little bit of moisture to occur, but I don't see big soakers coming down the pipes for right now. The system coming up Monday into Tuesday, that's going to be the best one for right here in the Red River Basin area. You get 150 miles to the west, not going to be quite so good. So Montana and the western Dakotas continue to come up short on that moisture.
Sure. Temperature-wise, then too warm?
We're going to go from one extreme to the other. Yeah, next week we'll probably spend 2 different periods where we'll get temperatures up into the 80s and maybe over 90 degrees. And right behind that, we'll see highs in the upper 50s and 60s. So it's going to be quite a toss and turn that we'll see.
Which is typical this time of year.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. But with the dryness, it'll be more extreme.
Yeah. As dry as this soil is, what kind of moisture will it take to break a drought?
You know, it depends on the time of the year that you get that moisture, right? I mean, you can pick up 2 inches of rain and have temperatures in the 40s, and you don't need a whole lot more for a while, right? So if we're going to be seeing temperatures in the 80s and 90s every several days, you're going to need a lot more than that. And I think really practically we need to see several inches just to get us a little cushion so we can get into spring. But to be honest with you, I'd really like to see big soaking rains occur. I know I don't want it to happen during the harvest. That's a big problem, but we need to put moisture back in the soil. We are not done with drought in this country, and we've got more of that coming up, and it's really important that we put more moisture in the soil.
That's what I was kind of thinking about was, okay, what happens next spring?
Yeah, you know, we've got, I've been doing this for 42 years, okay, and I have not seen so many signals pointing to the same conclusion as I do right now. So if you'll bear with me a minute, I'm going to walk you through some of these things, okay? We've got, first of all, we have a La Nina coming back, okay? We're not in La Nina now. La Nina tends to dry out the central part of the country. During the autumn and winter, we do get less than normal precipitation. The early autumn tends to be very warm. That's kind of where we're at right now. Precipitation gets to be a little restricted, and as we go deeper into the winter, we get colder. When you have a La Nina event, you end up with a northwest flow pattern aloft, so all of our air comes in from northwestern Canada, so we don't get a lot of precipitation once that pattern gets established. Now, La Nina is not with us today, but it is expected to be kicking in the next several weeks. So by the time we get to mid-October, it'll be in somewhat control. So as we go November, December, and January, we'll expect to see cold bias conditions, a lot of low humidity, probably light snow events. The one thing that will happen here is that we'll get some of those Alberta clippers coming along. We'll get some snow with those. But the moisture content in the snow will be low. And so we're not going to be able to do a lot in putting moisture back on the ground to be absorbed in the spring from that pattern. Now, that's La Nina in the winter and autumn. Now, if La Nina, for some weird reason, sticks around in the spring, then we're going to get an early start to the spring. We'll be warm quickly. We'll end up having a low amount of precipitation for a while. So these moisture deficits we have out there right now will probably keep for a while, for a long while, actually. So La Nina is not a real good thing for us. Now, it's not all about La Nina, though. And anytime we have a La Nina, a lot of times the forecasters get focused on that, but there's all kinds of other weather patterns. This year, our 18-year cycle pattern, which is the one that controls our jet stream, it has the same northwest flow pattern, not only in the second half of autumn, but winter and spring as well. So if we keep a northwest flow going into April, we're going to narrow down that window of opportunity for putting significant moisture into the ground before we start heating up again. So it becomes a little bit more of a questionable situation. So you've got La Nina in the 18-year cycle. We have a 22-year solar cycle playing out right now. Now, the solar cycle is really important. When you are at as a quick review on what a solar cycle is, it has to do with the sunspots, right? Sunspots are little dark blotches that appear above the surface of the sun, and when the sun gets hotter, you get more of these spots. They're little magnetic field changes which, when you look at it through a telescope, they show up as dark spots. Anyway, you go from a minimum number of sunspots to a maximum in about 5.5 years, and then you go back to the minimum, and that whole 11-year period is 11-year cycle. There's a 22-year cycle, which is obviously double that, okay? The biggest difference between those two is that the sun changes its character from one 11-year cycle to the other. The North Pole becomes the South Pole, and the South Pole becomes the North Pole. Talking magnetically now, all you really need to know is that the pattern we're most interested in right now is the 22-year solar cycle, because we get more intense droughts in those 22-year cycle events. Now, every solar cycle, 11-year cycle, between the solar minimum and the solar maximum, there's a higher potential for La Nina events to occur. And they're always stronger events, and they tend to last a couple of years. Now, if you remember last year, we had a La Nina, okay? The La Nina lasted till the spring and then went away, actually late winter, and now it's coming back again. So it's very classic to see this pattern in an 11-year solar cycle. The problem is those 22-year cycles, those La Nina events are more intense. And if you go back at 22-year intervals, you'll find you'll run into the 1950s, the 1930s, and then around 1911. Those were serious drought years, multiple drought years for the North American continent. We are already 2 years into this dryness in the western United States. Canada is 4 years into it as of now. Here in the north central part of the U.S., we're really just 1 year into it. But we are seeing dryness picking up from here southward, and La Nina is going to continue to promote that. The 18-year cycle is going to promote that, and the 22-year solar cycle is going to promote that. One last thing to be thrown in here is the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, which has to do with ocean temperatures off the west coast of North America when they are colder than normal. We get a tendency to create a trough of low pressure on the west coast and a ridge of high pressure in the middle of North America. Well, in the wintertime, a ridge in the North American continent, in the middle of the continent, that's not a bad thing. We have a warm winter. The problem is in the spring and the summer. And if you have a negative PDO that's present in the spring and summer, you tend to get ridginess building up early, so you're hotter and you're drier starting your growing season. And then in the summer, if you're already behind the 8 ball on moisture, you get incredible heat and you get a more dominating dry bias. So if we take all what I just said and put it together, there's very little moisture that's going to come in over the winter and late autumn across the middle of North America. We're already drought-ridden from the heart of Canada's prairies through the entire western United States. We are seeing the northern plains are currently, we're seeing a little break here in the eastern Dakotas and Minnesota, but the west is just critically dry. Our little break here will last for a while, but once La Nina kicks in, we'll be kind of done with that for a bit. So we're going to come into spring with the same moisture deficits we have right now. The drought here in North America right now is about as extensive as it was in 2003. If you look at the drought monitor that NOAA produces, you will see the same aerial impact from 2003. And we've been paralleling the 2003 drought in a very similar way. So if you go and look at what happened in the autumn, winter, and spring of 2003-04, the drought persisted. The same areas that were in drought in the autumn were still in the drought in March. So with all that said, the evidence to me is overwhelming. And you come into spring, we're still dry biased in many areas, and then you start warming back up again. If the PDO is still negative, we're going to have a pretty big increase in the amount of heat and dryness that's around, and the dryness that's current is going to be expanding into the western Corn Belt and into the larger part of the central and southern plains. So I'm pretty concerned about it, and that's why I say I think this rain that we want to get here this autumn is so very important. The more moisture we get, the better off we're going to be, not only for our crop use in the spring, but we need moisture in the soil just to feed back into the atmosphere to help tame the temperatures and to feed thunderstorm potential. You know, if you're really dry and you come into the rainy season and you got no moisture feeding back and you have a high pressure ridge over, there's no hope. You know, if you have a lot of moisture in the soil and you put a ridge of high pressure over your area, well, the heat of the high pressure system will warm the soil and bring all that moisture up out of the ground and help to create thunderstorms. So the worst thing you can get is a dry soil, a dry air, and then a high pressure system, and that's what worries me about next year.
Sure. The radar this morning, we saw quite a bit of rain north up into Canada.
Yeah, most of that's pretty light. It's kind of drizzle. You know, they're getting a pretty significant cool air mass. I say significant, I mean, it's just the first one of the season. But, you know, a lot of times when you get those big, deep, upper-level, low-pressure systems that come in and bring that cool air mass down there, you get the drizzle and the spotty showers occurring. When you look at radar, everything's green, and you go, oh, wow, they're getting good rain. But that's not what's happening. Yeah. We're talking about 0.15 of an inch over a big part of the prairies.
Yeah, I've seen that earlier this year too, where we've had rain, looked like on the radar it was raining, I was right underneath it, and
Yeah.
just not hitting the ground.
That's right. We call that a drought.
Yeah, exactly, exactly.
So yeah, that's the problem. For whatever reason, you got perfectly good weather systems coming through, but they just don't produce the moisture.
Once again, if anybody has any questions for Drew, here's your chance. We'll just visit and ask questions. Got a question over here.
Hold on a second, we'll get you a mic.
So you've explained how all this is affecting our weather. How is all this affecting South America?
Good question. Good question. Yeah, South America was impacted last year by a La Nina event. Typically, just typically with a La Nina in South America, what tends to happen is that Argentina is a little dry coming into the growing season. Southern parts of Brazil tends to be a little dry initially, and then they get a bunch of rain in the south, and in the meantime, the main production areas in center west and center south Brazil see erratic rains. And the initial rains that come with their that supports that early soybean crop, and when it gets planted in late September and October, that's dependent on what we call pre-monsoonal showers and thunderstorms. In a La Nina event, those pre-season showers and thunderstorms tend to be much more limited. So what we would traditionally expect is that their seasonal rains would be late again, like last year. But it's not going to be just like last year. Last year was an extreme. The La Nina event that we had a year ago was already underway in August. And it really was intense when we got to the start of their growing season. It just locked out all the potential for rain. So they really got behind the 8 ball. This year's going to be different. La Nina's not here today. Their preseason monsoonal showers begin in about 10 days. There's no way La Nina is going to kick in so significantly that they don't get some of those initial rains. Now it's dry, but most of their moisture comes from the north up in the Amazon basin. So they still have their moisture source. The bottom line is that later in the year, if I take the same anomalies that I mentioned before, the 18-year cycle, the solar cycle, and La Nina, and throw them together, what you come to conclude is that there is a greater potential for dryness in southern Brazil most of their summer. Southern Brazil would be, really includes Uruguay, northward through Rio Grande do Sul, up to Paraná and Paraguay. All of that area in the south would have a tendency for less than normal precipitation. And it's not just, a little bit here and a little bit there. It's kind of continuous through a long part of the growing season. And on top of that, they too have had multiple years of dryness. It hasn't been so dry they can't grow a crop, but their water supply and river and stream flows are terribly low. The Paraná River, they put barges on there and ship the grain downstream. And that river is, I don't think they can even ship half of the weight that they've shipped in the past. So that river's in critical shape. So the long-term moisture situation in that part of Brazil is pretty darn poor. And so once again, if La Nina and all these other patterns kick in, they're going to have a tough go in the south. But one thing you do need to keep in mind, southern Brazil used to be really important with their production 20 or 25 years ago. But now, with the expansion in the northern part of Brazil, Mato Grosso is certainly king of the pile. It's the most important production area. And Goiás and Mato Grosso do Sul, they too are much bigger producers than they used to be. So when you have dryness in southern Brazil, it's not quite the earth-shaking, problem with production that it used to be. But one last thing is the ending supplies, ending stocks that we have. We don't have a lot of grain in the bin worldwide. We're short. So if we have a little problem down there in Brazil, and then we have a big problem in the U.S., then we're going to still have a big problem on the ending stocks.
That southern Brazil area, was that the area that was wetter last year?
Yeah, see, that's what I'm talking about. Every La Nina is different,
Yeah.
right? Traditionally, La Ninas should be drier biased in southern Brazil in the summer. It was not that way last year. The problems were all further to the north. And see, that's the mistake that a lot of forecasters will make, because they'll just say, oh, we got a La Nina, so this and this and this are going to happen. The problem is there's other weather patterns that are playing around in the background, and they all have to interact with each other. So this year we have a more active, we have a more active weather pattern in northern Brazil and less so in the south. And so I think that we'll definitely see the drier bias this year.
Does that spill into Argentina then too?
Eastern Argentina, yes. I think this year, that's another thing too. In the past, a lot of forecasters got into the habit of making all of Argentina drought in a La Nina. That's not true. It's true of the most recent La Ninas, but prior to that, it was always Eastern Argentina that had the problem. And what it tended to do is it was dry early on, so their early corn and their sunseed would be hurt, and then the rains would kick in time for soybean planting and the second corn crop or the late corn crop, and those crops would end up doing better. And that's what will happen this year. The dryness that's in southern Brazil will bleed over into a part of eastern Argentina. Argentina's main production areas will be just to the west of that, and they'll still do okay. But they'll still have some issues.
Well, that's one thing too. I think a lot of people forget is we don't exactly know where their major production areas are.
Oh.
So we're hearing, well, Argentina's having a drought, so we just assume right away it's their major production area.
Yeah, and that's a bad assumption to make sometimes. Yeah, last year early on, it was for sure the drought. The drought was over the main production area for sure. But as time went along, it was more the east again, and I think that's why they ended up doing a little better than what some folks were thinking.
Sure. Once again, if you have a question for Drew, just feel free to raise a hand. We got a microphone in front of you. Let's talk about coming up here this winter. What are you seeing for a long-term outlook here for this winter for here in the Northern Plains?
Yeah, I think for the most part, we're going to see way out to the west in Montana and up into Alberta, we'll probably see an abundance of snowfall, possibly. Typical weather guy, right? The reason why I say possibly is because traditionally when you get La Nina, you get that northwest flow. And what happens, you get those surface high pressure systems coming out of northern Alberta, and they come right down through the heart of the prairies into the northern plains. And what they do is they create upslope conditions along the front range of the mountains. So Alberta and Montana usually get a lot of snow in those, as each one of those little systems comes down. But with everything I told you guys earlier here in regard to the 18-year cycle and the 22-year solar cycle, there's a good chance that ridge is going to be a little farther to the east. And if that's the case, the snow is not going to be as good out to the west as it would be in Montana. They need that. So does Alberta. For here, with the ridge shifting a little bit farther to the east, we'll probably get a little more cold than we usually do. In a traditional La Nina, the coldest air tends to be a little farther to the west, but it's going to be a little more east this time. So here, southward into the heart of the U.S., there'll be a lot of cold air in January through March. Last February we got hit with a little winter, and it got pretty nasty cold. I think we could do that again, but the impact is going to be far greater in the southern parts of the U.S. than this higher latitude. Because there's not really that much cold air available. But when the cold comes, because it's so dry here, it's not going to moderate. The air mass will not moderate as it passes through. So places like Missouri and Ohio River Valley, they're going to feel a whole lot more cold than they would normally. Whereas our cold will probably be a little bit more typical. Yep. You get that? So. Anyway, and then as far as the precipitation for this area over here, I'm afraid it's going to be less than normal. Sometimes in those La Nina years, we can get a lot of snow to build up across a part of the upper Midwest. The Red River, some of the big floods we've had in the past have been in years where La Nina was prevalent for a while. But I don't think that'll be the case this time around.
Same kind of for the Eastern Corn Belt then, or not?
Eastern Corn Belt is at least in a better position. They've got a lot more moisture to start with, right? So that helps them a lot. In a pattern like what we're talking about, they will have a potential for storms to occur more frequently. So the eastern part of the Corn Belt will have an opportunity for frequent rain and snow events. And with the cold coming up in the heart of winter, probably above average snowfall for like Ohio and Indiana and points eastward into the mid-Atlantic states. In the farther west you go and you get into Illinois, the precipitation probably become a little bit lighter again. So maybe not so great there. It's not going to be a really bad dry year. I'm making it sound terrible, but I'm doing that for a certain reason. I just don't want people to, when we start getting precipitation, I want us to keep in mind that there's moisture deficits of significance that are still out there, and that we need to make up for that because what we have coming in the spring and summer is still going to be a problem next year. So the more moisture we get, the better it's going to be. It's not just going to be a belly-up dry winter, but it's not going to be one that's going to be real fruitful either.
Yeah. Had a friend yesterday who said he dug some post holes with a postal auger, and after this last rain, he said there's moisture down about 8 inches, and after that, dry.
Yeah, you know, we did a study for Canada just north of here. I said there were 4 years of drought. They are 11 to 23 inches. They've missed 11 to 23 inches of normal rainfall over that period of time. Canada doesn't get that much moisture. You know, that's a lot of moisture. And they were digging in the ground earlier in the year, and they were going down 3 feet, and they were not getting anything but dust. That was really one of the reasons why they went belly up this year. In the past 3 years of drought, they still had some moisture down there, and they managed to get just enough moisture, you know, to keep the crops viable, and they were reaching down and grabbing some of that moisture, and they were doing okay. But they can't do that anymore, obviously. And neither can the western Dakotas and Montana, and we're not too far behind that. Certainly, we did a good job in August, and things are better.
That's the thing, though. Some of the guys out west were saying, you know, we've always been able to get a crop out of the ground. And there just wasn't enough moisture to get that even a seed to germinate this year.
Yeah.
And you hear that in South America all the time, where it's too dry, so we're not going to plant until we see the rains. And is that a mentality that we need to be thinking about?
I don't know if I want to even suggest that's a mentality we should be thinking about. You know, we don't want that to happen. But you know, the thing that bothers me so much is everything that I've told you guys already today, and this multi-year solar cycle drought that I was talking about. It does run back into some of these other droughts that were pretty darn serious. You know, we do such a wonderful, you guys do an excellent job at managing your land. We would have already a dust bowl going right now if we hadn't learned from the past, in Canada in particular, but even down into the northern plains. And this drought is going to last long enough for that kind of thing to happen again if we're not careful. So we need to keep that in mind. I think that's important. But we always want to get the crop in the ground, right? No matter what. If nothing else, we don't get the insurance money unless we do, right? So we got to do that. But I am a little concerned. If any of you guys know me, I see some of you guys, I've been talking to you for a long time. But you know, I'm not a drought monger. I don't do that. I put those fires out. I don't create them. But this one disturbs me, just because of all these things that I've mentioned, and the fact that we have so much real estate that's dry already. And you add all these other patterns in, and it just doesn't look good.
Yeah, especially with the showers like we have been getting here, where there have been smaller, isolated showers. So some areas look okay, some don't.
Yeah, that's right. You know, you have to, if you want it to rain, you got to put moisture in the atmosphere. Right now it's so dry, every system that comes in is subjected to drying, you know, evaporation. So you got storm clouds coming in along a frontal system, and it runs into the prairies and the western plains, and everything just kind of evaporates away, and you're left with a few spits and spats, you know, as these systems come around. So it's really hard to get that really good rain event. And so what we need to do is we have to open the Gulf of Mexico up, get a massive storm over Montana, and just pull all that moisture up, and then get a good temperature contrast, and presto, we can get a major storm to occur. But with it so dry out to the west, we're having trouble getting those big low pressure systems until they're already on top of us. And then it's the eastern U.S. that gets all the moisture.
Sure.
So that's part of the problem. So whatever we do, and the winter is always a good time to try to change that atmospheric profile. That didn't happen last year, and that's why we got into the mess this year. The atmosphere didn't moisten up in Canada, and it didn't moisten up in the western United States. And the concern is that we'll do that again this year. But if for some reason we can get a really hyped up jet stream bringing storms in from the Pacific, we can be in a better position in the spring, and everything I've told you is a lie then.
Sure. Another question out here.
Would the hurricane season affect anything yet this fall, you think?
Absolutely. Not necessarily in a positive way, though, unfortunately. You know, hurricanes have a huge influence, and the more active years we have, the more it hurts us. Because those storms come in and they hit the Gulf Coast most of the time, right? They don't usually come up from Canada or something, whatever, right? The point is they come into the Gulf Coast. So the Gulf Coast, becomes a barrier for moisture to move northward while those storms are there, because the winds around a hurricane are counterclockwise, right? So if you bring something coming up to the Gulf Coast and the winds are counterclockwise, the wind is pulled, away from moving northward into the plains in the Midwest. So every one of those storms is a deterrent for bringing moisture farther to the north. Now, if we get a storm that comes into the Texas coast, and runs all the way up to eastern Kansas or Nebraska, then that's a really good deal, right? Because you transport a lot of moisture up. But I don't see necessarily that happening this year. We still have a lot of disturbances out there, but we're running out of hurricane season. The next 10 days look pretty benign. I think all the moisture in the next 10 days, tropical-wise, is going to be that Gulf Coast, Louisiana to Carolinas primarily. So probably not a real positive thing. Yeah, sorry.
It's been seeming, too, that the rains that have been coming across the country have been kind of training over the same spots over and over.
Yeah, that's right. And part of that's hurricane stuff, too, because, whatever you do to prevent weather systems from moving, then if you've got a trough of low pressure and an area where you got convergence going on or moisture coming up from the soil or wherever, and you get those thunderstorms to occur, if that frontal system isn't allowed to move, it's going to do that. You're going to get those training storms. And a lot of times the tropics are responsible for that, because you get into summer and you got a lot of tropical activity, and all those systems are moving up towards the Gulf Coast, which prevents the weather systems coming down across the northern part of the country from advancing like they would normally. So a lot of times those fronts end up stationary, and you end up with a significant rain event. If you go back and look in time, a lot of those bigger rain events that we get during the summer season are because of that. It may not be because of a hurricane, but because the jet stream's so weak, you get frontals coming along and they go stationary in the middle of the country and they just don't move, and you still have that conflict in the atmosphere, and thunderstorms develop, and they just train right along that same line until that front moves one way or the other. Yeah.
I remember earlier this year in one of your forecasts, you talked about some of the dirt blowing off the Sahara to the west, impacting some of that westerly flow. Do we see that same issue with some of the dirt that's been blowing around, or the smoke even? Does that have an impact?
The smoke does. It has an impact on the amount of heat that we get. Anything you do to diffuse the sun and the amount of energy that you get from it, it's going to make a difference in your temperatures, which then, of course, changes your whole dynamics in the atmosphere. So it does have an impact. If we were back in the 1930s, we had dust blowing around like crazy, and that tended to add to all the problems. You would think that with the dust in the air that it would act as nuclei in order to make it rain, but when it's so dry like that, there's no moisture for the dust to hook onto. So it's kind of if you get that dry, where you're blowing dust around, you're not necessarily going to make it rain. If you're out in the tropics, you blow dust off the Sahara and you get it out over the water there in the ocean, you might get some good storms to develop, but not in the middle of the continent.
Sure. Anybody else have questions? Feel free to ask Drew anything you want. We're here just kind of as a conversation, and just keep visiting here.
While we're getting that over there, if any of you guys are like your fruits and vegetables, I would suggest maybe dedicating a part of your freezer to some of that and go out and buy some of that now, because California is not going to get any better. And California is still going to have water shortages next year, and there's going to be some cuts in production. And that's something that my wife and I have seriously considered. If we wait too long, the prices are going to get so high, it'll be really difficult. But I don't think there's too many people that are planning that far ahead. But I would suggest that you might think that through.
So like 30, 40 years ago, Fargo was not in the middle of the Corn Belt. Now Fargo is in the Corn Belt. The Corn Belt has shifted north and west. How has that affected what we see?
Well, first of all, that's a great thing, right? I mean, you guys are in a good position now to start being able to play the big league game, I guess, if you want to look at it that way. There's all kinds of studies out there about how corn, in particular, impacts the climate. I don't want to. That's pretty much a pretty detailed thing to get into right now. But the most important thing about what you're asking, I think, is the mere fact that we're warming up enough that we can produce these crops at a higher latitude. And I think that's so important when you start listening to the end of the world doomsdayers, climate change people. you know, we get the word that we're all going to die because we can't grow crops anymore, but we've got a lot of land mass in the higher latitudes that could so easily be used to produce a crop, not only here but in, you know, Russia. You know, so I don't look at that as being as deathly as what some of the comments you hear about. So that's an important thing. But as far as the corn crop being this far to the north, it obviously puts you in a position where you're going to need higher volumes of rain down the road. So if we are indeed climate changing here, let's hope it stays, because if we go back into the 1980s style life where we don't get that much moisture, you know, growing corn and soybeans up here will become a much bigger problem rather than a good thing. And when you get dry, biased like that, you end up reducing the humidity, and if you reduce the humidity, you get more cold surges, and so we can end up hurting our crops up here with frost and freezes, both early and late in the year. And I know we're changing our varieties so that we can grow a shorter season crop and do that. But that's kind of the road that we walk on. We haven't had much problem with cold weather early on or late on in quite a long time. But we're overdue, and this dry bias that we've got around could do it, not so much this year, but maybe next year. If we still have another droughty year, we could get somehow have an issue. I don't know. I'm speaking way out of turn here.
Another question out here.
Australian wheat production.
They are looking good. Yeah, they're going to make some money this year. Australia wheat and barley and their canola crop looking really good. Last year was a bumper record crop. This year was looking like it was going to be that again, but they're having a little bit of issue. They've had a little frost. They've had some dryness issues in their northern production areas. Queensland is not a big production area at all, but they have not had rain, and they did have frost and freeze damage. So that's pulled them back a little bit, and we are a little light on some moisture in a few other pockets. So they're saying that it will be a close second on production for this year. The outlook, the biggest thing with Australia in the east, New South Wales in particular, but Queensland too, is that there's a fairly good chance that it'll be a wet harvest for them because of La Nina. Now, just like you mentioned, last year in Argentina, La Nina didn't do what it usually does. Last year in Australia, Queensland and New South Wales didn't get their big excessive rains that they usually get with La Nina. This year will be different, and I do think that it'll rain a bunch. And with La Nina on an accelerated plan of development here over these next few weeks, we'll probably have a fairly good opportunity for rain to occur during their harvest. So great looking crop until that point in time, and then you can go belly up on them pretty quick. So that'll be something to watch.
Randy?
Another question out here? Okay.
Weather modification used to be talked about a lot. Now it doesn't come up at all, it seems. Are there things going on that we're not aware of?
Okay, say the first part of that again.
Weather modification,
Oh, weather modification.
cloud seeding, things like that. Are there things going on that we aren't aware?
Yeah, that's such a tough little subject matter. The problem is the same thing with climate change. Weather modification and climate change are very similar. You need two Earths right next to each other to make comparisons with, if you're going to seed a cloud, you want to have a cloud over here and a cloud over there with the same surrounding environment, and you seed one and you don't seed the other, and you look and see what happens, right? We can't do that. Instead, we seed what we seed, and then we make judgment calls as to whether this rain came from that seeding or whether it was nature. And it's such a difficult thing. I think it's great that we're trying to do that because it can help us, and at times, there's folks in Alberta, Canada, that swear the government is ruining their crops because they're seeding clouds on a regular basis, and what they're doing is they're detaining the intensity of the storms until they get a little farther away from the front range, and so they're ending up with these huge hailstorms one after the other, and the farmers are all blaming it on the government. It could be a little climate change in there that's causing that. We're warmer, and so the storms are getting more intense, and they're drifting a little farther to the east, and so they're getting hail where they didn't used to get it. It's a really tough thing to try to decide. I consider myself a rather impartial person when it comes to judging the weather modification programs. I think that there is definitely some benefit that can come from it, but trying to ascertain some kind of correlation and be able to speak with great confidence that this will do it. I don't think we can do that. In China, every time it rains, they do seeding over there too. And every time it rains in China, they quick to raise their hand. This is all because of our seeding. You know, well, the last 2 years, China's had so much rain that it's ruined a lot of crops, right? They're not raising their hands anymore. You don't even hear them talking about it. I doubt seriously it has anything to do with what's going on. I really think that the rains in China are just as cyclical as the drought is in North America right now. So I don't know if that doesn't really answer your question, but I don't know that I can answer your question without lying to you. And everyone knows I can lie, right?
Yeah. Former Soviet Union wheat crop, they've had some issues.
That's right. And like the United States, La Nina doesn't like Russia. La Nina tends to behave similarly in Russia as it does in the central United States. So there's extra watch right now on the Russian situation. We are very dry right now in most of the Volga Basin, which is where their primary winter wheat crop is planted and produced. Most of that area is going to get rain in the next, well, starting this weekend and going through most of next week. Probably 1 to 2.5 inches of rain is going to occur across all that. That's going to shrink that dry problem down to maybe 20%. Maybe that's too much. I don't know. But later on in their growing season, when we get out towards the spring and especially the summer, they run the same risk that we do. And a ridge of high pressure usually develops somewhere over central Russia. Sometimes it's their spring wheat crop and their sunseed crop. Sometimes it's their winter crop. But there's usually some kind of problem. And if you might recall, back in 2010, they had a terrible, terrible drought, and they also had extreme heat like we had in the northwestern U.S. this summer. And it all came from the super ridge that came out of nowhere. Well, that was a byproduct of La Nina. So it's not every year. You know, we can't sit down and say that, you know, it's another La Nina year, Russia's going to go down the tubes. But Russia has a higher potential of having some issues with their crop, just like we do. This year they did get a spring wheat crop that shrunk down a lot, just like ours. And that was associated with the same phenomenon.
Hey, Randy, I've
Yes.
just got a quick recap question for Drew. And Drew, I know earlier on in this conversation you talked a little bit more about the drought, what we've been seeing up here in the Northern Plains. I wondered if you could just do a quick recap for maybe those that joined a little bit later here for your presentation. How do things look out in western North Dakota? Do you see things improving, conditions improving, and how soon, if that's the case?
Yeah, western North Dakota probably has a little bit lower potential for getting a lot of relief relative to the eastern Dakotas and Minnesota. And that's just partially just climate. You know, it just doesn't precipitate out there like it does over here. The Gulf of Mexico is rarely open to them as often as it is here. So it's a much more difficult and bigger challenge to get moisture over there. But the bottom line, recapping, is that we still have drought from Canada down to the New Mexico border, and we see nothing but support for maintaining a dry bias over the autumn, late autumn, winter, and even into early spring. Don't read more into that than what I just said. Drier bias doesn't mean no rain. We will get some moisture, and it's all about timing. So if we manage to get that precipitation to occur in a timely manner early in the year, early in the planting year, you know, we could do all right still, you know. So we don't want to write it off. We don't want to go home totally depressed. Weather guys don't have a clue what they're doing, and myself is included. The only reason why I'm speaking like I am today is for the reasons I stated earlier. I just see too much handwriting on the wall right now, and it's really hard to turn my back and say, oh, don't worry about it. It's going to be okay. You know, I think instead we should be prepared for higher prices, you know, which is good for you guys if you can get a crop, you know. But I think we're definitely moving down this thing.
What about snowpack in the Rockies? I know the West Coast lives and dies with water runoff, I guess.
Yeah.
And what is that looking like?
Yeah, for California, the northern part of California will do better this year than they did last year. So the northern Sierra Nevada will have better runoff. I'm not necessarily saying they're going to go back to normal water supply there, but they'll do better. Southern California, the southern half of the state, no. They're going to still have below average precipitation. They will be lucky if they can break even with where we are in the water supply now. So I imagine that they'll probably be somewhat similar to what they are now rather than a big improvement. In the Pacific Northwest, water supply in the Cascades and the Northern Rockies will be good. They should have near normal snowpack in the coming year. The Pacific Northwest will actually do better. Columbia Basin and the Yakima Valley, Snake River system, they should all do better with this winter than they did last year on precip. You get into the southern Rocky Mountains, southern half of Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, no, they're going to be worse off. They don't get any moisture. The Colorado River system is going to be hurting a lot. The only thing that they have going for them potentially is that PDO I talked about, the negative Pacific Decadal Oscillation. If it is strong enough over the winter, it will push the trough of low pressure into the west coast states, and we could churn a few storms up through, pull moisture up through Mexico and into the southern Rockies. So there's some potential that might help, but I don't know, I can't put a lot of money down. The rest of the northern Rockies, though, fairly good snowpack. So the biggest problem is going to be California into the southern Rockies and southward.
You see that snow moving a little bit east or not?
You know, I think it's going to be hard to get good snow in the plains anywhere outside of the Front Range area. Again, I think Montana could do okay, maybe Wyoming. Northeast Colorado, probably not. You get out into Nebraska and Kansas, the heart of Kansas, no. No, I think it'll be drier bias there. They'll get their storm or two, but they're not going to get what they should get.
So that could impact that winter wheat crop then.
Yeah, I think, you know, the planting moisture is really not bad right now because of the rains that occurred 2 weeks ago. And their moisture profile is a little low, but it's not critical. But with La Nina coming in, warmer than normal temperatures for the next 6 weeks, followed by a persistent northwest flow, which is going to limit moisture coming in from anywhere, they're going to dry out. The bulk of planting occurs in October, so they're going to be running shorter and shorter on moisture. Those guys that get in the fields and put that crop in quickly will probably get some germination emergence to go, but then they're going to have a little bit of an establishment issue. And those that wait too long or they don't usually plant until later, they're going to have a little bit of problem with emergence. Yeah.
All right. We're about out of time here this morning. Any final question for Drew? We got time for maybe one more, if anybody has a question.
For the most part, yeah. I think that's right. The question was, you know, I think winter's going to be mostly dry and cold, and I think that's probably more correct than not. We'll have a lot of little snows that are dry snows, okay? So, you know, you'll see snow fairly often because it's so cold, but you know, if you take it inside and you melt it down, you're not going to come up with much moisture, and I think that's where it's going to be at. And the temperatures, you know, I do feel it'll be cold middle of winter, but this autumn, these next several weeks are going to be mostly warm biased, quite warm biased. And that's part of the problem. We lose more moisture from the soil that way. So, yeah. The spring, you know, March is not going to be good for us, but it never really is. April and May, we have a window. That window is going to be so important to us this year, because I think the summer will be dominated by that negative PDO, and we'll have a ridge developing fairly strongly in the middle of the country. So April and May is where it's all at. So I think we'll have some fairly routine occurring rain events of lighter than normal intensity, and that everybody's going to get a little bit of moisture and we'll be all over it, right? You should be all over it. Okay? Make sure you take full advantage of it, because I can't promise that June and July are going to be anything like that. So that's precursor stuff. You know, it's bad enough I'm doing predictions into the winter. You know, when I start going into summer next year, you know, somebody would just, you know, take a gun to me and just say, "You're so stupid." You know?
Throw a dart.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, so, you know, and I know you guys know that, but it's going to be an interesting year, most definitely. And with the South America situation, it'll be even more so.
Drew, appreciate your time here.
Thank you very much.
Let's give Drew Lerner a round of applause.
All right.
Pick up a cap if you need some here. We've got Ag Country Farm Credit Services seminar coming up next, just a few minutes here. And appreciate your attendance, and thank you very much for coming.